Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and it always gives me great pleasure to be able to record a podcast series. It's a beautiful summer day here in Pennsylvania, and I hope that this finds you well. Today I want to talk about how we take a giant step forward in improving decision flows and decision support. So let's start with, what is decision support? So decision support software is a broad category of software to basically improve decision making. The thought is that we could take statistical models, we could put input, run it through some form of algorithm or optimization. And now we're talking about reinforcement learning and deep learning and lots of different techniques. But basically, the model then gives an output that can then drive better decision making. This evolved to tools like trade promotion optimization, advanced planning, transportation management, warehouse management optimization. We have lots of decision support tools within the supply chain world. But what if we wanted to make a step forward and drive higher levels of effectiveness? And how do we embrace what's possible at the art of the possible and redefine capabilities? That's what I've been studying, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So let's start first with supply chain planning. I get a lot of those yada yada talks of I'm going to have an end-to-end supply chain optimization program that's going to, I'm going to insert my words, solve world hunger. And then I go to clients after they've implemented these large projects and I look at the effectiveness of planning and I'm like, wow, they're not using the tools. It's turned off, they're using Excel spreadsheets. Or I do an analysis of forecast value add on demand planning and I see they're not lifting the forecast. So I think about all of the money that we've spent on supply chain planning and about what it could be, particularly with the art of the possible. So how would we get started? Well, the first step in getting started is to recognize that supply chain is about a series of decision flows that is more than just engines and modeling, and that these decision flows need to include policy to strategy, which includes the design of the supply chain and the flows and the buffers, to engines, to workflow. Now, these decision flows need to be designed with the goal in mind. And lots of times when I ask people, how do you design what's possible in making decisions with new technologies, they look at me like, aren't you the strangest analyst in the world? And I guess many listeners might think that I am, but we need to think past convention. So today's supply chain planning technologies are often really driven by users with an average tenure of 2 years with the organization. They turn over frequently. They're not clear on the definition of supply chain excellence. And when they do cleanse the data and run the optimization engine through its paces, it isn't always adopted, right? Many times people think they know better than that demand plan coming out of demand planning. But what if we took a different route? What if we thought that demand, instead of a snapshot of time-phased output with hard-coded numbers, what if we thought demand is a river? And that river flows through the organization and changes based on the market. So in the pandemic, when restaurants closed, people went and cooked at home, and the river was high for baked goods and it dried up for food service. Likewise, the river for digital at-home appliances in the pandemic was tremendous, but the river for events or multi-party activities dried up. So that river ebbs and flows, and it may have eddies. And we have market events, which we're going to call drivers, market drivers, and these are things like weather and GDP and housing starts and what's happening in unemployment. Those are market drivers. And typically 40, 50 market drivers will need to come together to be able to drive an outside-in market signal. And then inside the organization, we have what I'm going to call demand levers. These are ways that we shape demand. And shaping demand says that we're going to have internal programs to increase the attractiveness of the program. And this could include marketing or trade promotions or price strategies or rebates or new product launch. All of these are forms of demand shaping. But frequently what happens is we don't shape demand or increase market potential. Instead we shift demand. And when we shift demand, we move demand forward or replenishment forward, but we don't increase the market potential. We don't increase the share that the company has in the market. So the current programs to measure demand shaping will take 5 to 6 weeks. Only 50% of trade is ever evaluated. So what if we could see demand as a river, and we could understand market potential and baseline, and we could connect that to demand shaping programs to see, are we shaping or are we shifting? And we can see the impact of which drivers are changing based upon the outcome, and we could do what-if analysis. So the demand planner isn't just, a 2-year student employee out of school, but instead is more like a weather forecaster, looking at what could be the art of the possible. I remember when I was a child, when there was going to be a hurricane, and unfortunately most of the hurricanes in the United States either hit Florida or Louisiana, and there would be a news flash, and it would be there's going to be a hurricane in Florida, but no one knew the path, no one knew the timing, and there were not the projections of parallel paths. Today, we have different models. As the hurricane approaches, becomes clear which path it's going to take, and we have minute-to-minute updates. What if planning could be the same? What if planning could be like forecasting weather? Instead of looking at imprecise numbers with high demand probability, what if we could look at the map of demand and the river demand, see the ebbs and flows, see the market drivers, see the effectiveness of shaping versus shifting? That's all possible. That's all possible with new forms of analytics. But we have to say, if we have this technology, how would we use it? How would we use it to drive decisions? And that includes looking at workflow and answering the question of, what is the role of the forecast? What should the role of the forecast be in the organization? And how do I hold the organization accountable for making good decisions? Now, decision-making in organizations look very different. In a company like Johnson & Johnson or Unilever or Mars, the decision-making is very regional. It's at a local level, and there's not as much focus at a global level, and so there's a conscious trade-off of scale for local control. In a company like Procter & Gamble, the planners are much more senior. The demand plan is used by the company, and there's input from the divisions, but it's controlled by corporate. So very different governance structures. But why can only planners get to the data? Why is planning not self-service? Why do we have planning headcount when really if we had self-service planning where everyone in the back office could get to the planning system, then we could change, and it could be a lot like predicting the weather for the hurricane in the current state, right? So if everyone could get to the map, the demand map, and see the flows and see the impacts and see the drivers, it could be like going on to, weather.com and looking like the path of the hurricane. This is all possible, but we have to unlearn from the past to rethink what this could be. So instead of having orders and shipments tightly controlled to IT infrastructures, crank through an engine, producing an output, having sales, give us their idea about what they're going to sell, not really holding ourselves accountable for bias and error, forecast value add. We take a deep breath. If we looked at market potential and we looked at how are markets changing and how could we sense and translate, it would be a whole different world. But we can only take advantage of the art of the possible if we're open to the outcome and we can structure for decision flows. And we can ask ourselves, how do we better make decisions? How can we know if the output of a technology and the recommendation is a better decision, and how can we learn period after period so that we get better? This is also very possible, but making this transition requires redefining roles within the organization. So the sales team would no longer forecast. They would be looking at the effectiveness of demand shaping levers. The marketing team would just focus on marketing for marketing's sake. They'd be looking at market share based upon market potential and the effectiveness of demand shaping programs. And the supply chain team would be looking at buffer strategies and supply strategies based upon the patterns or the predictions like the weather map, so that they can look at the ebbs and flows of demand. Governance in supply chain planning is probably more important than the selection of the tool and the implementation. Knowing how should I make a decision, was it a good decision, and what is the role of planning in supply chain excellence? These are all tough questions that seem so easy, but they're really not. And we get caught up into, geek speak of end-to-end supply chain optimization. I ask people, what is an end and what is an end? Many times it's order to cash or procure to pay, and I'm like, okay, not sufficient. And what is supply chain excellence, and how many supply chains do they have, and what defines excellence for each? Very few people have those answers. But to make better decisions, we have to answer ourselves, what is supply chain excellence? What is a good plan? How do companies work with new technologies to improve planning, to drive learning? And that is not just putting AI or machine learning on top of existing technologies. Instead, we need to blow up and declare that today's planning systems are largely legacy and start to build outside in with market data, with market potential, and to look at how do I decrease demand latency so that I can move at the speed of business. So let me just talk about what is demand latency. Most people do not recognize demand latency, but demand latency is the time from shelf consumption or consumption in the channel to translation of the replenishment signal to an order. So for example, if a hospital uses PPE, when it reaches a certain level, it triggers a replenishment signal from a distributor, and when that inventory is depleted, it will trigger an order to a manufacturer. The time for that translation can be really long. When I used to work at a company called Clorox, it took 5 weeks of demand latency for blue label bleach or the normal bleach that we sold. When we added products for lemon smelling bleach and mint smelling bleach and proliferated the items, that latency increased by 30%. And so the order is not a good indicator of the market because of the time it takes to translate the market signal to the order. And as a result, because all of our planning systems are cranking on orders, it puts the supply chain on the back foot. It's always reactive. And we're not able to learn, and we're always blaming the demand plan and maybe the demand planners. But in this new world that could be, planning could be self-service, where we could see and we could drill down based upon a weather map of the stream of demand and the impact on potential supply and the effectiveness of demand shaping programs and the learning and recommendations for each person in the back office to make better decisions for their business. This is the world that could be, but it's only if we're able to unlearn, to not think about demand planning in traditional terms, not think about supply planning in traditional terms, but to challenge what is the art of the possible, and then challenge how should the organization make decisions, and how can I make sure that the decisions are good ones. So this is Lora Cecere. I'm not a consultant, I'm an industry analyst. Consultants know the answers, and industry analysts help people to find the questions they should be asking. And those are the questions, my friend, that I think you should be asking as you look for new planning solutions and you think about what you're doing. Now, if you're interested in more of this approach, you should follow the work that we're doing on Project Zebra, where we're defining outside-in processes, and we're working with the old Apex organization, now renamed ASCM, to test and learn and to be able to give us a basis of what would this mean for the corporation and how can we get better. And some of these results of the testing will be shown at my conference, and that will be in Franklin, Tennessee on September 7th through the 9th. And if you can't make it in person, maybe you can't travel, maybe money's tight, maybe you don't want to do the risk because of COVID, there'll be an online presence, and you can set up a pass for your entire company to groove on a conference room to see the conference. We hope to see you there. But meanwhile, think about how could you make a decision, and how could you improve decision-making processes, and how can you build systems that learn. Until next time, this is Lora Cecere, Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights.